Good evening, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World Talks. On Sunday, Serbians in 9 municipalities and 1 city went to elect their local representatives. Why is this local vote important for the entire country? And what consequences will it have for President Aleksandar Vučić? To talk about it, we're joined by Ivan Vejvoda, senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. Good evening.
Good evening.
So I know that that the vote concluded at 8. So when will we learn the results?
Well, results are expected in about an hour, hour and a half maximum. And the significant piece of information is that the turnout has been very high. In quite a few of these municipalities, it was around 70%. The prior municipal elections were held with the parliamentary elections, which always sort of pulled the vote towards higher attendance. And so when local elections are held alone, as we know throughout European countries, the turnout is rather low. But here, because of the stakes of the vote, they were very high.
What parties were taking part in the elections?
Well, of course, there's the ruling coalition with the Serbian Progressive Party, the Socialist Party, part of that coalition, and a few smaller parties that make up that coalition. What's, of course, interesting is that in all of these municipalities is that the lists were headed by the president of Serbia, Mr. Aleksandar Vučić, which goes to show that he is the one who carries the vote for the majority, then opposition, but most importantly, a mix of student civic lists, which are the result of the ongoing student civic protests that started with the terrible tragedy at the train station in Novi Sad on November 1st, 2024.
But were the students themselves taking part in the election?
Yes, student lists were taking part. They fielded candidates, and there is an expectation that this student or youth list, the young of Kula, this municipality called Kula, there is a chance that they might win in that municipality. In the others, apparently, first sort of rumors are that they are doing well. These municipalities are spread throughout the country, in the east, in the center, and in the west. It is expected that in the east part of the country that the ruling coalition will win. But again, everything hinges really on the result itself. Will they do better, equally, or less well than in the preceding ones? So the rating of the ruling coalition will be judged by the numbers. And what's important to note is that there were very significant disruptions and brutalities even by thugs who were there to disrupt these elections. I think that betrays the insecurity of the ruling coalition as to the results, possible results of these elections. So they deployed these people. And interestingly, the police did not react to these brutalities, to these digressions, to the disruptions that occurred. Also, I will note that in a country that is roughly about 6 million people, these elections included registered 210,000 voters.
I see. Now, what does it tell us about? Well, you say that apparently the ruling coalition feels insecure about its grip on power in the country. But what does it tell us about the state of democracy in Serbia if Aleksandar Vučić has to resort to hiring thugs to discourage people from voting against him?
Well, in various fieldings that institutes around the world who follow democracy Serbia is named either a hybrid democracy, or in the most recent one that the Bertelsmann Foundation that does tracking of democracy, Serbia has been called a moderate authoritarian country, which is the second from the bottom of their rankings, which means that the regime uses these kinds of methods to try and show that it is still a coalition that wields power and that has support. What we have been waiting for is the calling of full parliamentary elections, because the regime has lost legitimacy due to the fact that after this tragedy and the massive protests of students and citizens, we haven't had yet a serious trial of justice for those responsible for that tragedy, which I think also reveals the insecurity of the government to show possibly the involvement of certain ministers and high-ranking officials in what clearly was elements of corruption in the reconstruction of that state, of that station. So there are speculations that there will be parliamentary elections towards the end of the year, or maybe even into the beginning of next year, because the mandate of the president ends only in May of 2027. So he would have to call elections somewhere in March or April at the latest, probably in March. There are also speculations that the president, whose two mandates actually impede him from running a third time, might decide to switch positions and become prime minister of his government, which would allow him to stay in power even longer, because the mandate of the government runs until the end of 2027.
But I'm wondering whether the scenario you have just described is conditional. I mean, do the students' list have to score really great in these municipal elections for this to become reality?
Absolutely. First and foremost, everyone agrees, whether it's the opposition or the students, that this crisis of democracy and of constitutionalism it has to be resolved peacefully through elections. And thus, in a certain sense, we are, quote unquote, hostage to the electoral calendar, which, of course, is determined by the length of the mandates, both of the president and the government. And so we have a sort of a political attrition where the lines are locked in, the trenches and the front lines are there. The energy of will to change is there, even though the protests are not as frequent and maybe not as intense, but certainly the intensity of what goes on throughout Serbia. And we're not only talking about the capital. I think it's important to understand that this is literally in every single city in Serbia that these protests have happened. And as we're talking today about these municipal elections in 10 places, the turnout of people into the streets and to the vote, I think, demonstrate their willingness to want to change things and return, and that has been the basic demand of students and of the citizens, to the rule of law, to the separation of powers, because we are living in a form of captured state.
I see. But what makes you so certain that even if students take power from the ruling coalition, it will only lead to democratic reforms and not to a further decline of democracy in Serbia? Because there have been some allegations that, some nationalistic slogans were seen during anti-government protests. So, what's your assessment?
Indeed, the political front that is required to defeat a coalition as the one that is in power now has to be a very broad-based one, from left to right, with a strong center. And thus there are, as you yourself mentioned, people on the center right, or a center right that goes even further right, with nationalist overtones. But the opinion polls that have been done among the students especially show that a majority of around 60–65% are pro-democratically, pro-liberal oriented, with a desire to go towards membership in the European Union. And of course, we must repeat, Serbia and the government officially every day repeats that the strategic goal of Serbia is to join the European Union. Now, in these elections that will happen at some point, there won't be a clean-cut break from black to white or whatever, from ruling coalition to a clean opposition student government. We'll go through shades of gray, I'm sure, but what is sure is that there will not be a full majority anymore for the coalition itself. And thus, as in all politics, it will be up to those forces who gain positions in parliament and possibly to rule, to find ways in which they will actually satisfy this demand to a rule of law, because what we're living is absolutely contrary to the constitution of Serbia, where the president, and as in other countries, does not have the power that a prime minister has. It is a protocolary function, but this president has taken all reins of power into his hands, and that is a great source of dissatisfaction that we're seeing in these student and civic protests, and of course in the opposition.
Now, one last question. Should we expect this absolute pivot towards West if the opposition takes power in Serbia indeed, or rather this balancing between the EU and Russia, the way Aleksandar Vučić is doing so far, with some successes? Wouldn't you agree?
Indeed, at the international level, he has been able to mitigate these different positions, principally by strong support for Ukraine. He himself visited Ukraine. He sent his wife several times to Kiev, but especially the fact that Serbia was an important purveyor of ammunition through third countries, of course, never recognized as direct, but by all counts, very significant contribution to the Ukrainian war effort. Very close relationships with France. France is building Belgrade Metro. Serbia is buying French fighter jets, the Rafale. France has a concession on Belgrade Airport for the next 25 years. So to put it very simply, Serbia's money employs many French people in the French industry. And then, of course, there was the promise possibly of lithium mining for the purposes of supply chains for the German car industry. Now, that's been put into question. But to go back to what you're saying, yes, there's been a kind of able balancing here. But the key here is that Serbia now has to buy actually and change the property of its main petroleum company, which is in the hands of Gazprom and Gazprom Neft. And there's possibility that the Hungarian MOL petroleum company will buy out the Russians, because there are sanctions of the United States that are hanging over Serbia over its energy situation.
It's also interconnected. Ivan Vejvoda, senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, was our guest this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for watching, and stay with us for more interviews here on TVP World.